Musician Lex Sadler joins me in the chat cave this week, but before we get to the interview, friends, have you subscribed to Coming Up Next yet? I know I bang on about this each and every week, but it's so simple to do, so if you haven't done it yet, I mean, just go and do it. You can do it at comingupnext.com.au. It's really simple. It's really straightforward. You just go to comingupnext.com.au, you select the platform that you want, if it's iTunes or Spotify or whatever, and it's going to download automatically for you each and every week. I mean, what more could you ask from a free podcast? G'day, folks. Welcome to another episode of Coming Up Next, the podcast. This is Coming Up Next, the podcast. You probably know that because you downloaded it. I'm Alistair Marks. This is my show. Thank you to last week's guests, plural. Thank you to the Bano twins for coming on the show and sharing their story of growing up in the industry together, and I guess kind of having a divergence. You know what they feel like the way they feel like the industry's changed in the 15 plus years that they've been a part of it. It's a really great conversation. If you haven't checked it out yet, you can find it at comingupnext.com.au, along with the entire back catalogue of podcast rambles, complete with rambly introductions as well, I should add. That tune you just heard at the head of the show, that was not the usual Coming Up Next theme song. That was Monotronic, off the album Polytronic by my guest this week, Lex Sadler, from his project Rhythm and Stealth. You can find that album on Spotify or iTunes or wherever good music is streamed, downloaded, or sold from. Lex has got a remarkable story about moving from Perth, from the Perth music scene, over to New York City, forging a career there. It's been a little while since we spoke with a musician on the program. So when I was offered the chance to speak with Lex, who, aside from his various musical accolades and achievements, has played on shows like Letterman and Colbert. He's played at Electric Lady Studios, or recorded, at Electric Lady Studios. Played at the biggest jazz clubs in New York, places like Blue Note. So very grateful and very fortunate to introduce you to my guest this week on Coming Up Next, Mr. Lex Sadler. So how long ago did you make the move over to New York?
I moved here in 2007.
Wow.
Beginning of the year. Yeah, it's been a long time.
It's been a while. And
almost 12 years now.
You grew up in Perth?
Yeah, Perth. Pretty much spent my whole time in Perth, actually. I took a little break in Sydney at one point. Didn't really work out for me and returned back to Perth, but always really, had really wanted to come to New York. So that was kind of the big move.
Oh, that's cool. What was it about New York, I guess, from Perth that was so appealing?
Just, as far as being part of music and part of the world, I felt like it was really the only option for that. I'd thought about the London route for a long time, which is typical of, people from Perth, like to go to London and spend a few years. But I'd always had this fascination with New York, and I visited back in 2004, I think, for a couple of weeks, and I just realized that at that time, that's really where I want to be. So I went home after that trip and really strategized about how I'd be able to make it over.
Right. Yeah, I could imagine that, particularly for someone who's in an artistic scene, specifically music, that a place like New York, which is really one of the hubs of the world for not only, I guess, playing music, but creating music and as a music community.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's legendary status, but I just wanted to be part of something bigger, I guess. I'd done plenty of music stuff back in Perth.
Was it something that you were doing? Was it something you'd been doing your whole life?
I started pretty late. I think I started when I was about 17 or 18. I mean, I played piano as a kid, but really took bass playing seriously in probably my early 20s.
Right.
So I did start a bit late. I wasn't always kind of gung-ho on, I've got to have a music career. But I knew I wanted to do something with it at some point.
Yeah, right. So what was when you started playing piano, was that something that parents made you do, or school made you do, or what?
Yeah, my father was pretty heavily involved in some music education back home, and he played himself. And it was one of those things you do as a kid, and I do remember it with mixed mixed emotions. I remember some of it was pretty tough. I remember piano exams being nightmarish. My piano teacher was a mix of nightmarish and, encouraging, maybe encouraging through some of the nightmarish stuff. But, there was also other, opportunities in that, around dabbling with, I remember the school had one synthesizer back then, and this is, the 80s. So that was a big deal. And I got to tinker with some, synthesizers back then. And that kind of got me interested in electronic music and all of that kind of stuff. So it was worthwhile doing. And then I guess I stopped doing that when I went to high school. High school was just a different thing as far as, what the focus was there. I was at a private school. It was more about academics and, sport and rowing and all that stuff. So that kind of, was a bit of a drop.
Yeah.
At that point.
I can definitely relate. My old man was a French horn player.
Okay.
And when I was, I think 10, we were at school. We were offered the opportunity to choose an instrument.
Right.
But choice was a very kind of loose term for me because I was kind of forced to play French horn for a year.
Right.
And my teacher was my dad, so you could imagine that
right.
I wasn't particularly enthused by the whole situation. Do you remember what the first time, like your first experience of like actually playing either piano or bass, or when you were playing on that synth was, where you kind of had that experience that really sort of set you up for what you're doing now?
I actually think it was when I started playing bass, actually. Piano was very much there was some ensemble stuff, but it was very much a solo thing where you're playing for your teacher, or you're playing for, an examiner or something like that. You're trying to pass tests. And really, I think when I first really fell in love with it when I started playing bass, and I started actually playing with other people, and I realized, oh, okay, music's actually something you can do, with others and improvise. And, the piano stuff is very much classical training. So, it's about reading and reciting and all of that kind of stuff, but actually playing and improvising and jamming with people, I think is kind of what really got me excited about it.
And what was was there like a band that you started playing with, or was it just the kind of the collaborative experience?
Yeah, it was a collaborative experience, but also I got into it. This is back in the late 90s. I got into a funk jazz band in Perth called Delicatessen, and for the time, we were doing some pretty high profile stuff around the city. So I very quickly kind of got into the scene, and got a taste of what it's like to, actually play to people who were interested and cared about what we were doing. Yeah.
I could imagine that would be quite gratifying and definitely spur you on to continue.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was a pretty good time for the Perth music scene as well, like that late 90s period. There was a lot of stuff going on, especially in, the Fremantle area, and a few of those places were quite happening, and progressive actually for music. And I can hear a lot of stuff now that's coming out of Australia that's, reminiscent of some of that stuff that we were doing.
Yeah, right.
That long ago. Yeah.
And so I guess between sort of the late 90s and making the move to New York in 2007,
yep.
What were you up to? What were you doing?
Well, I went back to school I'd actually dropped out of first year uni. I dropped out of an architecture course, and I was really spending my time playing bass nonstop after I dropped out. And then I realized after about 6 months, well, this is good, but I should probably go back and, get a degree. So I actually went to study graphic design, and following that, I got involved in, that first wave of internet design stuff. So I had a full-time job doing that, playing music on the side, for quite some time, actually. I was pretty heavily involved in that scene as well.
Was it an easy balance, or was it a lot of late nights, early mornings?
It was a lot of late nights and early mornings. But after about a year in my first job, I quit. I'm a bit of a quitter. I quit, and actually I started my own business about a year in, really so I could kind of afford myself the flexibility to do other things. I never really enjoyed being on someone else's clock, so to speak. So it balanced out pretty well at that time.
Yeah. And so I guess intermittently, or you moved to Sydney for a couple of years.
I did not last a year in Sydney.
Oh, you didn't even last a year? Okay, cool.
No.
I can understand that.
I did not gel with Sydney. There were elements about it that I enjoyed. I mean, it's a beautiful city, but I found it quite difficult to get integrated into Sydney. And, for a couple of reasons, I decided to come home at the end of 2004. And that was around the same time I made my first trip out here.
Right.
To New York. Yep.
I mean, what did you see, I guess, as the difference between the difficulty in bedding into Sydney, but then feeling quite comfortable in New York?
I just think that's a big question. I think because there's so many people from other places coming into the city here, it just seems a lot more welcoming to me. Sydney did not really have a welcoming vibe. I do have some good friends that I did meet there that would probably hate me for saying that, but there's just I don't know. There's just something about the collective of motivated people from different places in New York that just kind of gets you flowing with the rest of it, if that makes sense. I remember telling myself before I moved here, I was kind of like, well, you're going to New York, don't expect to do anything in the first year. If you don't get a gig in the first year or you're not playing, it's going to take a while, blah, blah, blah. And then I very quickly got into it here just by meeting a few people. And it's just a lot of energy that, kind of connects everyone who's very motivated to be doing things here. So that was a big difference for me.
Right.
Yeah. It was quite a bizarre kind of paradox, I think, because I really would have expected it to be a lot more difficult to get into the scene here.
I suppose you would expect it to be more like the runs on a ladder than a kind of weird, I don't even know what kind of metaphor to use, but I do understand what you're saying. Was it an easy decision then after you'd been to New York? What was the feeling like? Was it almost immediate? Like, I got to live here?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm like, okay, I've been here 2 weeks. How do I, what do I do to continue to stay here? Because I really felt like that during that first trip. I'm like, well, I need to either leave now or just stay forever, because I kind of felt even at that time, things could happen really quickly. And I think that's what I still enjoy about the city. 12 years in, I feel like really anything is possible at any time. So I just wanted to be part of that energy. So as soon as I got home, I had thoughts of, okay, how am I going to get back out here? Which is easier said than done, really, which is why it took me a couple of years.
Right.
to get back.
And what was the process of making that happen?
Well, it was just a lot of patience and kind of, working towards opportunities that would get me in the door here. Because the immigration stuff is pretty tough. I'm still dealing with that 12 years in. So I was fortunate enough to have some work opportunities with actually a London-based agency that were opening an office here in New York, and I was able to help them do that, and that was kind of my ticket in.
Right. What sort of stuff were you doing with them?
Well, that was all digital work, so digital marketing stuff. So I didn't even really come in, as a musician, so to speak. Actually, not even legally did I come in as a musician. I came in with a whole different working visa, with the intention to make something happen with music. So it was, it's kind of a pretty different way to arrive in some respects. It didn't mean that I had to kind of come over with, one bag on my shoulder and a bass in the other hand and see what I could kind of do. It was a much easier ride, I would have to say, having a job when I turned up. What was then difficult was balancing the two lifestyles, because everything here just happens in the wee hours of the morning. And that was pretty rough and intense.
What do you mean when you say? What do you mean when you say everything happens in the wee hours of the morning?
Well, I mean, the first gig that kind of introduced me to most of the scene here in New York was a jam session called Freestyle Mondays. And it was a hip hop jam session, and it was on every Monday night. And we were trying to start that early for years, and by early I mean around 11 o'clock, and people just wouldn't rock up until about 1 a.m. So as hard as we tried to get that started, at a reasonable hour, we were starting that gig at about 1 in the morning, which meant that we would finish at about 4 in the morning, which meant that I'd be getting home about 5 a.m. and then I'd get up and go to work the next day, and be in the office by 8:30, 9 o'clock.
It's crazy.
And I would do that. And I would do that every week. And that's how I would start. That's how I'd start every week. And, then it just continues through the week. Like there's something every night, and it's still the same. And I see people out, to all these hours of the morning. And I just think, what do you have to do tomorrow?
Yeah.
Because they all get up and go to work. So it's pretty remarkable, actually.
You have to get up and do a podcast.
Got to get up and do a podcast.
So I suppose in those few years, in those few years between when you were trying to make the move to New York happen,
yeah,
how were you kind of developing your repertoire as a musician in terms of the sort of gigs you were playing? Were you just kind of side manning, or were you putting bands together? What were you doing? I was pretty much side manning at that point. And I was really just doing stuff locally in the Perth scene. I wasn't particularly, I wasn't really going for anything major back home, because I kind of knew that I didn't want to be there, and that I wanted to get here as quickly as I could. So I was playing quite regularly back home, but I wasn't trying to put together a successful band or anything like that. I'd kind of been through those years with Delicatessen, and I think we finished up in maybe 2003, but I'd kind of done that local original band scene for 4 or 5 years, made a couple of records, that kind of stuff. And I really just didn't want to do that again, to be honest. I just wanted to kind of chill a little bit and play as much as I could, and then just get out here as quickly as I could. Which was, in the end, pretty good for my playing, because I was playing a lot, and I was, practicing a lot, and I was getting myself ready to get out here. Did you find that, Well, I suppose what was the more challenging aspect of kind of bedding into the community in New York, into the music scene? Was it the kind of logistics of balancing your life, your work life with, like we were discussing before, with the music life, or actually connecting with musicians? What was the...
Yeah, it was a connecting with musicians was probably the hardest part at first. I was randomly introduced to a singer named Mariella on a gig. This was probably about, I would say, 4 or 5 months after I moved here. I'd done a few little bits and pieces, but then I had a period where nothing was going on, and I was, a bit concerned about what I was going to do. And I was introduced to her, and she hosted the Freestyle Mondays jam session. She said, why don't you come through and sit in one night? And I started going to that. And that's really how all the connections started happening. Back then I think it was still the MySpace days. So, there was some social media in place, but it wasn't nearly as ubiquitous as it is today. And, you did have to dig a little deeper in the real world to get connected with people. Nowadays, it's a lot different. I think it's a lot easier to connect with folks now, especially if you're new to a place. But back then, I really had to find it and then show up consistently until people, remembered who I was.
Was there like a watershed moment for you in that regard?
Oh, I mean, that was a watershed moment. It was like, okay, well, I can actually do this, and I can actually, I'm here, and I'm actually capable. I'm not, just some lackey from Perth who has a dream of being able to play. I can actually do it here, and I can do it on the level that I want to do it. It was, it was a pretty interesting time because it still felt, I think, with the lack of, social media or the infancy of social media, it still felt quite underground and, kind of a hidden gem, and this kind of like I'd unlocked the secret to getting into the New York music scene.
Yeah. I could imagine in those first few years that you probably would have played quite a diverse slate of gigs. I mean, I know that you have played on Letterman and Colbert, and you've played at the Blue
Mm-hmm.
Note. What are some of the like standout kind of best and worst gig memories you have from that sort of earlier time in New York?
I plenty of worsts, a lot of worsts. I mean, I remember, back then I remember, mate, we would, you would look through Craigslist, ads. Craigslist is kind of like a online, classifieds website. And I remember responding to one for someone, and I ended up, the first gig was, I went to Queens, way out in Queens to rehearse during the middle of winter. And then our first gig was way out in Long Island in the middle of the day at some bar, and there was literally no one there. And I thought, what am I doing? And then on the other hand, I think Letterman for me was kind of a great memory and a great moment because, I really used to watch that show back home. I mean, I watched it with my dad a lot back home, and I would dream about coming over here and just trying to get tickets to go and see it. So, being able to go and play on it. And I think I played in either his last season or his second to last season. So I just crept in before he went off the air.
Yeah, right.
For me, that was a really great moment. But then, I'd been so toughened up until that point because there's been so much disappointment leading up to that, which was, disappointment is a really big part of the music business. So, I remember getting the email to do it and thinking, okay, well, don't get excited about it until you actually step out on stage, because this could evaporate any minute. So, that was definitely a good one. And that was a good one to be able to, call home and tell the folks, hey, tune in I'm actually doing something with my life
What
out
was
here, you know.
what was the story of that gig happening? Who was the band that you were playing with, and
That was with Ellie Golding, and long story short, she was coming out for a couple of TV gigs in New York, so just needed a local band. Couldn't bring her backing band out for those two dates. So I'd known a couple of people that, you know, I'd just made those relationships over time, and they needed a particular look and feel for the band that they wanted. And yeah, that's how I got that. That's how I got that opportunity.
right?
I don't know if being Australian helped or hindered me, but yeah, it was it's funny. I've ended up doing a few things for British artists that come over and need a band. So maybe that's my thing. But yeah, it was pretty exciting to get that call.
Keeping it in the Commonwealth.
Keeping it in the Commonwealth. Yeah, so that was a really interesting experience. You know, it was during a blizzard here, and his theatre is notoriously cold. So I just remember, you know, being so cold right before the gig. I'm thinking, I don't even know how we're going to be able to play this. But we got through it, and yeah, it was just great to be part of, you know, such a legendary show, especially in his last season, you know, before he went off air.
It must be quite surreal to be like, you're so used to looking at it from the audience's point of view, to be looking at it from the kind of set's point of view must be quite surreal.
It is, and then you realize just how tedious television production is, and how tedious the whole, you know, you're playing for 4 minutes in a show that's taping at about 4:30 p.m., but you've been there since 8 a.m., you know, waiting for the stage to be set, you know, going through numerous sound checks, camera checks, lighting checks, all of that stuff. And by the time it comes time to shoot, you just kind of, you know, you're on autopilot by that point, just waiting to get it done with. So it's kind of a weird, you know, most gigs you walk out on stage, you play for 40 minutes and then you're good. And this is just a day of waiting for a 4-minute performance. And once you're done, you're kind of, well, now what am I doing kind of thing. So, you know, it's definitely interesting, and everything's much smaller than it seems. You know, the sets are really small and cramped, and, you know, when you're looking on TV, it just looks like this huge, massive room, and it's really actually quite small. So, yeah, it was a pretty interesting experience.
Yeah. You said before that being a musician is kind of dealing with disappointment. I think that's probably true of a lot of creative fields, especially if you're freelancing. It's like, how do you navigate constant rejection or constant disappointment?
Well, I mean, I just learned after a while not to take it personally, because I've just seen, I took it very personally in the beginning. I think, you know, when opportunities wouldn't happen, I'd be like, well, why? You know, what did I do? Am I not good enough? Am I not this and this and this? And then I think I've seen how it works now on so many different levels, that nowadays I'm a little bit more open-minded about things, and I generally just don't, you know, if something doesn't go my way, I kind of, you know, quickly move on from that and look for the next thing, I think. But I remember back in the early days, I had a couple of really big ones that really stung at the time. And I thought, okay, that's it. You know, nothing, you know, that was my shot. Nothing's going to happen now. You know, it's over kind of stuff. And I realized it's just not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely something to be said for having that, I guess, not taking things personally, and also, I guess, having patience on your side.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, you know, the other thing I've learned too is that I think the days of the big break, as they call it, are kind of over. You know, especially in the music business, that one golden opportunity that, you know, takes you into the stratosphere. I just don't think that really exists anymore. I think it's more of a a series of little breaks, and then you're just back into the cycle. Which is it's a good and a bad thing, I guess.
Do you think it helps to be, because you're, as well as being a sideman musician, you've also put your own projects together, so there's, I guess, a diversity with the way that you're approaching the craft. Do you think that helps as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's good and bad things about being a sideman. I think on most sideman gigs, you always wish something was maybe a little different. Maybe you would do the music differently, or you would choose different people, or whatever it is. And then, conversely, when you're doing your own project, there's a whole other set of pressures. Like, are people going to like my music? I've got to come out of pocket to put the other musicians on stage. I've got to promote this thing. I've got to make records. I've got to do this, and this, and then I've got to make, other content and all of that stuff to support it. Sometimes it's just easier to turn up and play someone else's music, take the paycheck and go home, rather than deal with all of the other stuff that comes with being an artist that has your own project. But I think the balance of the two is pretty healthy. I've gone through periods of not playing any shows for my own project, and then I've also gone through periods of doing weekly things for that, and then you get sick of organizing everyone, or organizing every gig, or promoting every gig. I think the promotion side of things is probably the most exhausting and the most tedious aspect of it. Just trying to get people out to shows is not easy. And it requires so much work of the artist these days. Those days of having a manager and a PR person and a booker and all of this stuff is those days are over. I think the artist is responsible really for all of that now. So it's a lot to kind of deal with when really you just want to be playing music.
Yeah, there's kind of a sense that as an artist you have to be an entrepreneur as well and be able to push all these kind of facets along.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think your ability to do that sometimes is maybe even a little bit more important than your ability to make music. I think, the successful artists these days are the successful self-promoters.
Yeah.
And it's a funny thing. It's such it's just not an Australian thing, if that makes sense. Like, self-promotion, that's another thing culturally. I kind of struggled with at first. It's just, some of the confidence of people here is it's just counterintuitive to what I grew up with. We're very much, Australian personalities are very much, oh, well, yeah, it's not bad. We're kind of somewhat the self-depreciating, and
well, it's part of the tall poppy thing, and it's almost like modesty or humbleness, but to a fault. It's not like it's not necessarily conducive to, like, I guess, success on a global scale, depending on how you define success, of course.
Yeah, I just learned that it's okay to kind of go out with some self-confidence. And, I mean, I've always, I always keep it pretty tongue-in-cheek too, when I kind of, promote myself here, because it's an inside joke to me in some respects.
Yeah, right.
But the way some others do it here is amazing and hilarious at the same time, and completely in earnest. And it's quite incredible to witness. I did a jam session the other night where I'm in the house band, and typically the first set is just for the house band, and we let others sit in the second set, and we're playing the first set, and I'm kind of in my own world, just playing, kind of looking down at my bass, and then I look up and there's a guy standing about 6 inches in front of my face that I don't know. And he doesn't introduce himself. He just says, he goes, I want to play bass. He's walked up onto the stage and standing right in front of me. And he goes, I want to play bass. And I go, okay, well, when do you want to play bass? This is as I'm playing, we're deep in a song. And he goes, oh, now. I go, you want to play right now? And he goes, yeah. I go, all right, mate, here you go. And, there probably would have been a time where I would be like, well, no, screw you, kind of just wait your turn kind of thing. But I don't care anymore. I thought it was quite funny. I kind of laughed and handed in the instrument. So, but I would never do that to someone,
Yeah.
It was just so strange to me.
The balls to do something like that.
Yeah. Not even give me his name. I still don't know this guy's name.
Yeah.
I've seen him a couple of other times. So, but it's such a thing here, kind of seize your opportunity, so to speak.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you have, since moving to New York, had the opportunity to, aside from the bass stealing guy, play with some of the foremost musicians in the world, as well as on some of the biggest platforms that are available.
Yep.
Do you feel as though, or what do you feel as though the kind of, I guess, consistent lessons or things or attributes that you've seen in some of these people have been that might have helped you with your own evolution or success?
I really think that it's, what I've seen is just to not take things too seriously. And, I say that from not only the perspective of, some of these gigs I've played, because, even at the highest level, there's stuff that's just, makes you scratch your head as to how it all works. But, some of these great musicians that I've played with, that I'd idolized before I came out here. I mean, they're just as human as I am.
Yeah.
And they have the same, they have the same problems and, humor and, the same things as I do.
Were you surprised by any of them?
I wouldn't. Well, yeah, maybe a couple of them. Well, yeah, in some respects, yeah. But I think what I learned is that most of these guys are, pretty easy to approach, and kind of goofy guys. I mean, they were probably music nerds at school that have found some kind of stardom and are now trying to deal with that in their own way, So when you kind of get past the initial, idea of them being a superstar, you see underneath that they're, pretty normal and funny and goofy, and they don't really take it too seriously. And I think that's been the lesson, is just to kind of, not take it too seriously. I think it's good to be serious about your career, but I also think it's good to recognize where, things are just stupid, and not to try and fight those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's just some things that are kind of immovable objects in each kind of industry. And the music business has so many of those things. And, you could sit there and try and lament it, or, wish for the days gone by where you could sell CDs at a show and do X, Y, and Z. That stuff just doesn't exist anymore. So it's good to have a sense of humor about that. And I think most of these guys that I've met, that I really put them on a pedestal, would probably have the same attitude, I'd say.
Mm. So when you came to starting Rhythm and Stealth,
mm-hmm.
was that a decision that was kind of, what was the decision born out of?
That was a pretty organic project. I'd been doing a residency at a club called New Blue, which is down in the East Village, and I'd played a few shows there with many other artists, and I decided I was given an opportunity to take a Monday night slot there. And, you know, there's a few jam sessions around the city that are usually hip hop and R&B orientated. And I'd always had an interest in electronic music. So I thought, well, I want to do something a little bit more electronic focused. And I just started dabbling in electronic production. So my goal with that was to, you know, roll up every week with a bunch of new loops and samples and things that I'd programmed and just kind of throw them at the band and see what happened. And it was a combination of that and also stuff that I'd just been tinkering with in my home studio that kind of really started the project. You know, there's songs that came out of jamming. There's other stuff that I'd, you know, pieced together while I was here at home. But yeah, it was this idea of combining, you know, live instrumentation with electronic music production that really kicked that one off.
And how long, I guess, before you really outlined the fact that this was going to be a project that you were going to be the leader of, that you were going to put together and call it Rhythm and Stealth?
I can't even remember when that moment was. I think I kind of had that before I started that jam session, but I kind of knew I wanted to put something on record. I think it's something that, you know, everyone that plays music wants to do at some stage. I don't know if it's for, you know, self-validation or, you know, validation of others. But for me, it was just a matter of, I want to get something down on record that kind of shows what I'm really interested in musically, because, you know, in this scene in particular, I'd just been playing, you know, hip hop and R&B for too long. And I'm like, well, is this really what I'm about? And it's not really. It's something I enjoy playing, but it's not. It wasn't an amalgamation of my influences, and I kind of wanted to really just show what I could do and what I actually like doing, and that was my reason for kind of for putting it down on record. But even that process was interesting and weird and morphed a few different ways. In as much as I'd made a record that was pretty much mostly me playing everything, and, you know, I wanted to release that overseas in Japan first, and I had a couple of meetings with some labels out there, and you know, their advice to me was to get more featured artists on the record, and I understood their rationale for it. You know, it's easier to promote if there's a few familiar names on there. But then at the same time, I'm just like, you know, is it not good enough as it is, kind of thing? Is it not good enough that it's just, you know, it's just me? And, you know, I think that was another lesson about taking things personally, because at the time I was kind of like, oh man, this is a drag to have to go and open these sessions up again. And, you know, am I just putting other people on it for the sake of this request, or is this actually going to enhance the music? And in the end, I'm glad I did it, because I think the product of involving other musicians is actually much better than what it was before they were involved. You know, it's just an interesting process, and I think it's kind of indicative of the way music's being made now, as far as, you know, recorded music not really being a permanent product, if that makes sense. I mean, I even got a notification today on a blog that I read that Kanye's updated one of his albums. So what does that mean? You know, like back in the day, you put out a record and that's it, kind of thing. And now, you know, people are updating music that they've already released. It's a very different approach, and, you know, it's a very different definition of what recorded music is.
It is an unusual, or I guess a new kind of paradigm to look at things through. Because,
yeah.
I mean, are you ever really completely satisfied with what you put out? Probably not, but
No.
you kind of get it to the level where you're like, this is now it needs to have its own life. But then if you introduce an element where it can be constantly evolving, I mean, I guess in a way they're doing that with film because they're rebooting and remaking every film these days. But
Yeah, it's true.
imagine if it wasn't a remake or a reboot, if they just went back and just changed a scene.
Yeah. I mean, well, this is what's happening with music. And I think, part of it is maybe a byproduct of the ease with which music can be produced now by literally anyone. And, I think, with the technology, I mean, it's so easy to be constantly either not finishing anything at all. I mean, I think the biggest challenge for us as artists is to just finish stuff. I've got countless sessions that I've, and ideas that I've put down that I've just never done anything with them. And, I think that was the point with my record. I was just like, wow, I've actually just finished something, I think it's the hardest thing to do. But now, what does it really mean to finish things? Because, well, when I play that stuff live, I'm using pre-recorded material that I integrate with instruments, but every time we do it, it's different. And now I hear it and I go, damn, I actually wish I'd used this sound in this part, because when I do it live, it sounds so much better. Or I wish I'd done this like this. Well, I could actually go and do that and put it out again. And, the attention cycle and span of people is so, it's so short now that, well, would anyone really care?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You could keep updating things and modifying things. And, this is the other thing too about, the paradigm of music as an art form. Well, is the album format relevant, or is it just a stream of, content and creation that you just keep putting out there? Or is it even, something that has to come directly from, from one person to the next? Or is it something that's a, collaboration between the artist and the audience? That's the way I think it's going. I think it's going to be more of a collaborative thing that involves, the actual audience and getting them involved in the creation. And people do that already, whether they're asking for, soliciting advice from their fans as they're putting a record together. I mean, that would never have happened in the past.
Well, I think even just having direct access to your fan base kind of changes the game, which social media has created.
Absolutely. It's very odd, because I grew up, I'm in that generation that kind of straddled the internet age. I'm kind of a little bit pre and a little bit post-internet. And, the way I see younger people use it today, I never thought that I'd, not be up on the edge of technology. But the way that they use it is just so different to how my generation does it. And it's funny to say that, having grown up with the internet and worked in that industry. I look at some of the ideas that kids are doing with Instagram and all of this kind of stuff, and the way they promote themselves and build their art. And it's pretty foreign to me. But it's definitely, it's less about creating a product and going, okay, here it is, like it or not. It's more of a, two-way conversation between them and whether you want to call them fans or whoever engages with them, their followers.
Interesting.
It's quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So, having had your album Polytronic out for a couple of years, I guess, or even, going back to the work that you used to do with Delicatessen, what was when you started in that sort of space, how would you have defined the band's success versus how you might define the success of Polytronic now, or the stuff that you're doing in New York?
Yeah, I think, Delicatessen was maybe 15 years ago, maybe a little longer actually. Back then it was still in the early days of the internet. And it was really about, well, we make a band, we practice, we write some songs, we make an album, we try and get that album reviewed, get it in stores, and then we try and get gigs and tours and festivals and stuff like that to promote that. And then that, I think, is just a complete opposite today, to the point where I feel like no one really knows, what that path is. I talk about it with musicians all the time that are trying to launch projects. And the general consensus is, we have no idea what we're doing. All we know is that we have to, keep creating and putting stuff out there and connecting with, followers, basically, because it's not really fans anymore, it's the followers. And how you do that is constantly evolving. And this goes back to my other point. I see younger musicians that have really large followings that haven't even, put out a record yet. And they're doing it through a conversation between them and their followers. That I think the older generation of musicians just doesn't really get that, how that works. And maybe we're a little protective of our art and don't want to be, democratic about how we create it. But the newer generation, I think, is just, they're so open to collaboration and this idea of ownership of art is just completely different now, to the point where I feel like, ownership of art doesn't really exist anymore by the creator or the consumer of art. You're streaming it, you're replicating it, you're duplicating it, copying and pasting it. This is how, I think this is how creators or the creators of the future are really working now. And would I look back even 2 years ago doing an album, would I do another album? I don't know. Is that the format that people want to consume? I'm not sure if it is. Would I have more success putting together a series of 1 minute Instagram beats with videos, maybe, or covering something or reinterpreting what someone else has done, or asking my followers to manipulate something I've put together or something like that. I mean, there's a lot of ideas as to what could be done, but I think the main conceptual difference is ownership and ownership of art. And I think that's what the older generation of artists struggle with in the modern age, is just, we have to protect everything we've put together, and, whatever I create is mine and I own it, and that's how it's going to be, and that's how you're going to consume it. And I just don't think that's the way anymore. I think it's just a more democratic, level playing field, because really anyone can do it now. Anyone can put together music. Anyone can put together visual art. Anyone can be a great photographer with technology.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you're a great photographer, but
well, you still got to learn the craft.
You know what I mean? You still got to, but do you? I mean, I don't know.
Well, I guess the learning curve is altered because I'm assuming kids basically have a camera available to them from a fairly young age. As soon as they get a phone, they have a camera.
Exactly. Or as soon as you've got a laptop, you've got GarageBand.
Yeah.
And, you've got it on your iPad, and you've got games and all kind. It's a gamification of making music.
Yeah.
You've got all of this stuff. You've got all of these tools, and you've got accessibility to what, everything. You've got the whole library of everything that's ever been created at your fingertips. It's where to go and sift through, physical records to hear things. I'm sounding like an old timer now, but it wasn't that long ago that we had to do that. Now you can't even give away a CD, not in America. In other parts of the world, you can. What was interesting when I put my record out in Japan, they insisted on physical media. And, it was in record stores. They still have huge record stores and people lining up to buy CDs. And here in the US, you can't even give it away at a show. And I can't even play my own record, the physical copy of my record, because I haven't had a CD player for years. But in some parts of the world they still have it. But here, I just think, when you talk about music as an art form, it's very much a technology-driven media and technology-driven art form. And when you talk about the influences in the industry and the people who are making the decisions and sitting around the boardroom tables and making the decisions for our future, it's tech companies, really, that are doing it. It's the Apples and the Spotifys and so on. So it's a pretty interesting time.
It's definitely an evolved world from, I guess, where we started, however many years ago. I often have the thought that our generation will be the last generation that remembers a pre-internet world, which right now makes me feel old to think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got kids born in the 2000, mid 2000s that are aware human beings that have no idea what it's like to not have that.
Yeah, or to make an arrangement.
Right.
And not have a means of changing said arrangement.
Right.
With person.
Absolutely.
You just have to turn up or find a payphone.
Yeah, exactly.
Now we sound old.
Absolutely.
And on that old note, thank you so much, Lex, for
No
chatting
worries.
with me. Hey, what was the gig you were at last night?
It was a jam session called The Shed. So it happens once a week. This one was out in Brooklyn. There's a few of those, but again, late nights.
Late nights and lots of whiskey.
Lots of late nights and lots of whiskey, yeah.
I end all of my conversations with the same question, which is, what makes you silly?
Oh, man. What makes me silly? That's a tough question. Other silly people. I mean, I just know a lot of great, silly people, and I think the sillier the better. Don't take things too seriously. Have fun with what you're doing, and just remember it's about enjoying yourself first and foremost.
Yeah. Any silly like gigging or touring anecdotes?
Yeah, I mean, the silliest one I can think of is playing the NBA All-Star Weekend halftime show at a stadium, playing for 3 minutes, sitting there for 12 hours, and then waiting 6 months to get paid. That's pretty silly. and taking the train home at the end of the night.
Yeah. Silly and tedious. I mean,
silly and tedious, and just a real insight into how it all works.
Yeah.
And why I'm pretty relaxed about things these days.
Yeah. I think you have to be, otherwise it'll just eat you away.
It'll eat you away, mate. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks so much, Lex.
Cool. Really appreciate it. Thank you.